It's a great privilege to be part of this conference. I'm looking forward to it over this day. I just want to say up front, I realize this is an international conference, and most of what I'm talking about is based on my experiences in North America. But I am confident that a lot of the issues that I'm talking about are relevant to other nations and other professional archival communities. So I have a formal paper, no PowerPoint slides, no video, no tricks in my pocket or anything. So this is just a good old-fashioned traditional conference presentation. So here we go. In the mid-1980s, the American archival community plunged into a period of intense rethinking and reflection about its mission, how well it was meeting the mission, its image, and its future. Planning was the operational term for everything the Society of American Archivists was doing. In fact, before then, there had really not been a well-developed sense of a mission. Debates within the archival community focused on the notion of certification for individual archivists. Thought was going to accrediting both graduate archival education programs and archival institutions. New predictions and projections emerged about the impact and implication of electronic records for the prospects of the profession, some of them quite dire. The period was dubbed the age of archival analysis, although some also characterized it as the age of navel-gazing. The leaders of the movement adopted a kind of progressive view of the world, whereby problems and challenges could be identified, evaluated, and resolved. There was a general belief that things would keep getting better. I certainly believed this. When all this started to happen, I had just begun my second decade as an archivist. I did not enter into this community as a reformer, but I arrived because I liked history and enjoyed using historical sources to understand the past. Of course, as so often happens, I found myself engaged by matters of archival knowledge, questions about how and why individuals became archivists, the nature of archives and record keeping, and in the debates about where individuals should receive their graduate archival education and what the nature of that education should be. At the time of my personal maturing in the field, questions and opinions abounded about what constituted archival knowledge and education, or even if such knowledge and education were really necessary. As I became more confident about my own archival work, I also became engaged in new ideas and emerging issues. My focus became thinking about what constitutes a profession of archivist. At that time, and still to a certain extent today, individuals became archivists with modest training to do so. Individuals discovered the field often by accident and went through a kind of apprenticeship based on mentoring and experience at a local archives. Yet the community, as we moved deeper toward the end of the 20th century, seemed ready and eager to be accepted as a discipline. I applied for and received a grant to be part of the Bentley Historical Library Research Fellowship Program for the study of modern archives at the University of Michigan in 1985 to explore more deeply such issues. My topic was to examine sociological and historical literature on the nature of professionalism and to relate this to the state of the American archival community. I immersed myself in this literature and wrote what I intended to be a benchmark essay for future discussions about this matter. This article became the basis for my first book, American Archival Analysis, published half a decade later, summarizing the turmoil, debate, and activities dominating professional conferences and the professional literature at that time. The original essay built upon the then new planning emphasis driving the profession, especially through SAA, and the challenges facing this professional community in articulating its societal mission and garnering the resources and status to accomplish this mission. My aim was to draw on the sociological models as a framework for improving discussion and planning about how to strengthen the archival community. I reviewed different models, focusing on the oldest one, the taxonomic paradigm, assembling the ideal characteristics of what constitutes a profession. Drawing from this model, I focused on 5 attributes relevant to then discussions about the archives profession, including even debates about whether this group constituted a profession. And these attributes were specialized knowledge, community sanction, professional cohesion or organization, professional culture, and institutionalized altruism. Using these attributes, I examined the stronger and better regulated professions of law and medicine, and then applied them to American Archivist. I argued that this community was weak in 3 of the 5 attributes, namely professional knowledge, community understanding and sanction of its mission, and professional cohesion. There was evidence of emerging strengths with the other attributes, although the archival community back in the 1980s still seemed to lack a strong identity and any degree of autonomy, and the sociological sense of it being a semi-profession or a mimic profession had credibility. A lot has happened over the past 30 years, something I am reminded of every time I look in a mirror, use my iPad or iPhone, and attend a virtual conference. Many of the changes we have witnessed have challenged the notion of a profession, namely the immersion into the digital era, the growth of indigenous populations and other communities in caring for their documentary heritage, the emergence of social justice and ethical practices as primary components of the archival mission, the appearance of the citizen archivist as a potential equal partner with other archivists, the increasing depth and expanding breadth of archival education and research, and the constitution of new archival fields. In my estimation, this and other developments, and I'm sure there are others we could consider, have transformed how archivists think of themselves as professionals and how others see them. As digital information technologies took hold, archivists grappled with the issues they posed. They wondered if the basis of their knowledge, fabricated in the analog world, was being undermined or even obliterated. There was also increasing speculation that there would be a convergence of various information professions, librarianship, archivy, records management, knowledge management, and museum curation, into forming something new, even if this was unclear what that might be. All of these fields shared a common interest in the document and its importance to provide information, evidence, memory, and accountability, even if the definition of document was becoming much broader and more far-reaching. The result of all this was a blurring of any distinctive qualities of what we have normally associated with the profession. Whereas only a generation or two before, archivists had focused on the distinctive aspects that separated them from other information professions and related fields, like historians and cultural studies. Now they look for what melded them together. And in this case, it seemed to be the growth in ever more powerful and ubiquitous information technologies. We are witnessing a new attentiveness to the value of archives in our digital world, an interest that seems to be unabashedly sympathetic, even nostalgic, in how it perceives old documents. Technologists seem intent on assuring us that nothing will be lost in our digital world, even going so far as to suggest that the new digital systems will enable us to preserve in better ways old traditional paper records, or to save everything that is created. How are various scholars and pundits writing about documents and archives, seeming to affirm that the more romantic interests in archives remain valid, even as they struggle with enormous technical challenges, such as represented in the debates about big data and digital stewardship. Archives ground us in both time and place, supporting our self-awareness and identity. The new technologies, even with their emphasis on networking, threaten to tear us apart, and this has profound consequences for how we perceive ourselves as professionals and what we offer society. One of the assumed features of record keeping and information management was control. With the development of the computer and networks, control has been considerably loosened. We can see this most salient in our current fascination with big data, what Alex Ross has termed as the new material of the information age. He sees digitization as another milestone following the earliest writing and recording systems up to the advent of computers and networks, focusing on the many new industries that this is spawning. Ross also sees the problems generated by our increasing reliance on and use of data, such as incursions on personal privacy and security, breaches from government to corporations. Control is being lost, the very antithesis of how archivists can function as professionals. This is transforming what archivists do, how they function, and how they define their mission. Whereas once we possessed a rather monolithic notion of the archival mission, now we have one that is much more complex and ever-changing. As Terry Cook summarized it, the mission now encompasses a number of paradigms: evidence, memory, identity, and community that compete with each other, sometimes in confusing ways. This reflects the increasing complexity of our society in demographic, cultural, and religious dimensions, just to name a few. We can collectively see this world in many different ways, and we seek to accommodate this diversity of perspectives. Just as I mentioned, this technology stretches us into new and greater ethical justice and other territories. There is an ironic aspect of this when it comes to the notion of professionalism. When we consider the basic aspects of what constitutes a profession, a code of ethics or professional conduct has always been deemed to be essential. It seems that a workable code of ethics is no longer possible. A number of cases within the archival community and within the preeminent Archival Association, SAA, has resulted in a code that is generally vague and deemed to be only aspirational. It is a symbol of a profession that has been pulled apart by a variety of contentious issues, such as the notion of social justice as an element of the mission and the rise of alternative gender agendas, such as what we have seen with indigenous populations. These are extremely complex matters, and I'm only touching on them in a very cursory fashion. The notion of social justice as a component of professional practice emerged from a variety of directions, including archivists working in nations where genocide, racism, and war had adversely affected personal and community identity, and from a younger group of archivists who were more activist by nature and calling. Social justice calls have led to some rancorous debates driving deep barriers into the professional community, making the professional mission anything but a consensus. Nothing demonstrated this more clearly than the debate about the Native American Archives protocols within SAA. Despite a long interest in Native American archives, the SAA split apart when it came to approving a set of guidelines only intended to help focus discussions about materials sensitive to indigenous groups' religious and other cultural practices. Many archivists feared losing holdings, long open, shut down, and even worse, having to return materials to the groups. It seemed to make little difference, for some at least, that these archival materials had often been acquired under duress or other suspicious circumstances. This has led those indigenous groups to develop their own archival training programs and to develop their own practice standards. Such debates have led to a different kind of landscape of archival programs, approaches, and communities than anyone could have imagined 30 years ago. We now have what some are calling an archival multiverse, the simultaneous existence of multiple views of what constitutes a record, evidence, and the mission of archives, defined by an increasing complexity of law, tradition, and culture. This scenario suggests, of course, that who archivists are, how they are trained, whatever form of credentialing is utilized, how they congregate, and whether and other such matters will continue to evolve in ways that are quite different from what was envisioned when I did research at the Bentley. Whereas we originally approached thinking of ourselves as members of a guild whose entry we sought to control, has now dissipated in unimaginable ways. I had ended my 1986 essay discussing the power inherent in professional formation, mostly as a means, I will admit, of shocking people in the field to think about who they were and what they did. But now, that power seems to be needed to be spread about in more loosely defined and inclusive ways. We can chart this broadening of the field in several different ways. Recently, that is, in the last decade or so, there has been a growing interest in the notion of the citizen archivist. Some have used this as a new way of characterizing what we used to term volunteers, but others have seen this as a new professional priority to equip the average person to be able to take care of their personal and family archives. Some have also devoted more attention to this as recognition that the nature of digital records will not allow us to accession these constantly evolving virtual documents in the ways we normally have for generations. That is, in fact, a challenge to one of the cherished principles of archival work, custody of the record in a legitimate archival repository. The digital era has brought with it a rebirth of the amateur in a new, honorable sense. If the old professional paradigm was one of holding ourselves from the public as experts, the ones with the appropriate knowledge and licenses to make the critical decisions from selection to preservation to description, now we are embracing members of the public as partners in the campaign to preserve our documentary heritage. In a sense, we share both our knowledge and power in order to achieve a loftier goal, one that does not seem to be quite as so attainable under the present circumstances. Another obvious difference can be seen in the emergence of many new archival fields or subdisciplines. For a long time, the identity of archives was invested in its connection to history and historians. When I started work as an archivist in the early 1970s, debate about the relationship between historians and archivists was raging. Even today, this continues to be a focus of the field. About the time I joined the ranks of archivists, there was a movement afoot in the United States to establish regional, state, and local archival associations, mostly viewed as alternatives to SAA. However, this diversification took on new meaning when about a decade and a half later, other specialized professional associations began to form, such as the Association of Moving Image Archivists, joining older groups such as the Association for Recorded Sound Collections, representing specialized forms of archival work. These, combined with an increasingly complex array of roundtables and special interest groups within SAA, the American Library Association, and other national associations, reflecting the increasing recognition of the challenges of documentary forms, both analog and dialogue and digital. Perhaps the most dramatic sign of change relates to the most core aspect of any discipline. It's knowledge. When I started my career in the early 1970s, the archival literature was extremely compact, limited to a small group of journals and basic textbooks. It began to expand in the early 1980s and continued this acceleration over the next few decades. When I worked with James O'Toole to revise his Understanding Archives and Manuscripts, we added new sections on archival theory and an extensive bibliography. If we were to revise that volume today, just 10 years later, and 20 years after the first edition, we would have many more sections to add. The growth in the quality and quantity of archival scholarship is very encouraging, save for one aspect. One of the most interesting features of this new archival scholarship is that much of it is written by individuals outside of the archival field, some of whom are now studying archivists and archival work in new ways. The attraction of this has to do with the inherent power of writing and record keeping. Scholars are now studying the nature of archives and the archive in a variety of expressions, such as in literature and art, testifying to the importance of the record or document in society in all dimensions. Some of the new scholarship has featured an interesting crossover between popular and academic scholarship, such as in the area of letter writing. We have witnessed a growing quantity concerning the creation and maintenance of certain kinds of documents. Letters and letter writing seem to lead the pack, perhaps a reaction against the decline in writing letters in contrast to email, Facebook post, and Twitter. But there is also a growing range of work with other documentary forms, such as cookbooks and diaries. With a growing awareness of citizen archivists, no doubt we will see other forms added to the scholarship. Along with this expansion in archival scholarship has come an expansion in the notion of what constitutes an archive and what archives mean. As we learn, it extends far beyond repositories and their contents to include buildings and symbols. A major part of such scholarship is considering how certain documentary forms were used to build self-identity and community. The point in all this is that where we once might have fussed about the vagaries of these different meanings, now archivists are actually embracing a variety of approaches to identify, preserve, make accessible a wide range of materials as custodians, partners, and enablers. Archivists are recognizing the expertise of others, including amateurs, citizens, scholars, and other professionals. Whereas a couple of decades ago, we recognized that the documentary universe was too big for us to develop unitary strategies for unitary actions, now we understand that it is too complex for archivists by themselves. Most of what I have described works against the traditional notion of professionalism, usually implying a guild-like sense of work and control, although it is unlikely that anyone will desist referring to themselves anytime soon as professionals. It is a kind of security and status achieved through a combination of education and experience. Yet it is also the case that sociologists and other scholars interested in professions, vocations, and work are now focusing on the strains and stresses on what all this means in our 21st century digital age. Sociologists themselves have been notching the dynamic changes impacting professions in the past several decades. Andrew Abbott notes that technological changes, transforming notions of expertise, the rising cadre of organizational supplies and for-profit service providers, diminishing government support, transition from reliance on text to that of images, and the rise of multiculturalism are all threatening the traditional perspectives of librarianship as a profession, perhaps leading it to something much different. As he says, a federated profession where control over entry into the field is lessened in favor of a more diverse group of experts with different backgrounds and perspectives. Nevertheless, professionalism remains an attractive notion for many occupations, since it suggests ownership of expertise, autonomy, and control, even if such ideas are more ideological or hypothetical than realistic. Given this trend, what replaces the idea of professionalism? Having stated this, obviously I'm convinced that something must be in place that gives a group like archivists some authority and mission to practice with a goal of a greater public good in mind. There's been a resurgence of interest in amateurism as an alternative to professionalism, and this fits well with the rise of the citizen archivist and the implications of the computer for loosening up boundaries and barriers in everything from work to governance. It has been well documented and endlessly debated that one of the problems caused by professionalism is inequality and anti-democratic sentiments that place citizens, organizations, and governments at the beck and call of disciplinary expertise. Some now consider the sense of calling and the love of doing associated with amateurism as traits somewhat shared by interest in professionalism, and in some cases even more important than the traditional attributes associated with professionalism. So, how could archivists view themselves and their future? Well, we suggest several new tenets as the basis for a new sense of the discipline. First, the archivist's focus should be on sharing their expertise with others. And I'm going to skip over some of this because I'm running out of time. Second, archivists must acknowledge the preeminence of the rights of others over their own heritage and rights. Third, archivists will de-emphasize developing tight, prescribed definitions of fundamentals like records and document evidence and information to embrace varying forms of what and how different cultures and indigenous groups see as being valuable for religious, cultural, symbolic, and evidential reasons. I have been critical in the past of those who make predictions about dominant societal shifts, such as from the analog to the digital, who often do so without specifying when such shifts will be complete, or who do so in a remarkably ahistorical fashion. The shift I am describing here is just beginning, and I believe it will take a full generation to occur. While we might be able to characterize this as a kind of new professionalism, we also could describe it as something quite new. We could adopt a form of biblical hospitality, and there's a definition of biblical hospitality that I won't read, but suffice it to say that it is about helping the alienated person, the traveler, widows, orphans, the poor, sojourners from other lands, etc., etc. Okay. You do not need to be a theologian to understand a notion of such hospitality. Vern Harris, a preeminent archivist from South Africa, drawing on the work of Jacques Derrida, discusses hospitality as a way of seeing archival work as a form of justice. Being hospitable implies something very different than the control and power inherent in the notion of the guilds of modern professions. Archivists are here to help people, organizations, and society preserve and manage their historical sources by developing solutions and other approaches in doing this and teaching them how to do this. Not only does this provide a pathway to a better understanding by the public about what archivists do, it opens up the possibility of a more rigorous ethics. And it is that ethics that the true professionalism resides, something that seems to have been weakened in the past 2 decades. Thank you.